Some key parts of assessment in education are grading, giving students grades, and standardized testing. So this video is about those two aspects of assessment. There are different ways to assign grades for your students. Here are some of the ways to choose from. First is mastery grading, which is you're grading on how much of the content students have mastered. So you could say they're at 100% mastery or 80% mastery or 70% mastery. So how much of the content have they actually mastered rather than giving an A, B, C, D grade. Norm reference grading. Remember, norm referenced is comparing to an average of a group or to each other. So norm reference grading would be comparing to others in the classroom. And this is like grading on a curve. So the top 10% of the class gets an A, the next 20% gets a B, the next 40% gets a C, and so on and so on. So that you rank students and then give them an A, B, C based on their ranking. The next way is a point system. This is what I use. I like to use it. I think it's the most clear cut. But a point system, different assignments are worth a certain number of points. You add up the number of points possible, and then the total number of points that were earned by a student, and then that equals a grade. Percentage grading is similar, except instead of points being assigned, it's a percentage of a grade assigned. So homework may be worth 15% of the grade. So you add up the homework and that as 15% of the grade. A contract system is where you come up with a contract between you and the students. It could be individual or the same contract for every student. And you sit down and you say, this is what it takes to get an A, this is what it takes to get a B, this is what it takes to get a C. This is not as common. I had one professor in college who used the contract system, and the contract was if you would like to get an A, you have to take all of the tests, write a paper, and take the final. To get a B, you have to take all the quizzes and take the final. To get a C, you have to take all the quizzes, and that was it. And then the C was the lowest grade you could get and pass the class. Some downsides to that is if you don't word it correctly, a student can say, well, I took the quiz, and they might not have actually learned anything, or I wrote the paper, but they didn't do very well. So you need to also, if you choose to use a contract system, include the quality of work, not just a checklist of things to do. Some general guidelines for you to think about when you're thinking about grading your students. First, you want to explain your grading policies so that everyone understands them. So explain early. You might need to remind students so that they know what does it take to get an A or what does it mean to get a B. You want to set reasonable standards. You don't want to have such high expectations that everyone is going to get an A, or what it takes to get an A is outside of what your students are able to do. So set high expectations, but be reasonable. Base your grades on as much objective evidence as possible. You want to minimize the subjectivity or the opinion type things that you're grading on. So objective criteria are really key in order to have fair grading. As a rule, don't change a grade. Once you change one person's grade, then you're opening yourself up to all kinds of complaints, which just becomes a headache and leads to less valid results, less reliable results. Guard against bias in grading. You want to guide to make sure that you're not having a halo effect or a horns effect. So the halo effect is where you have a student that you like, or they're generally a really good student. So, oh, they got it wrong, but they really meant this, so I'll count it. Or, I think they know it, so we'll just go with what I think rather than what they actually turned in. And the horns effect is the opposite. For a student that you maybe don't like or is not always a good student, that you automatically assume the worst of that student. A way to guard against bias is to grade as much as possible without knowing whose assessment you're grading, whether it's a test, a paper, a project. Maybe even have another teacher come in and you could say, do you think I was too harsh or too easy, or can you look at a sample of these papers and tell me if I was being consistent? You also want to make sure that students are well informed of their standing in class. No one likes to be surprised, especially if it's not a very pleasant surprise. So keep everyone on the same page and give students the benefit of the doubt. If you think, oh, it looks like they erased the correct answer, but I can't tell, give students the benefit of the doubt, because every test has every measurement has some error. So you want to make sure that you're not erring on the side of being too harsh. So giving the benefit of the doubt is important. Now let's talk about some of the things that you should avoid doing when assigning grades. First, avoid worshiping averages or overusing averages. Averages at the end can give you a good picture, but as you're going through, you want to make sure that you're looking at actual performance, not an average. So this could mean looking at the class average. Yes, that's important, but if you have a couple of students who are really struggling, that might get covered up and you might move on without helping those students. Or you might have a few students who are above the class average and really got it, and then you go back and reteach and they're going to be bored. So class average, also averages within individual students. For example, you may have a student who takes 2 quizzes and gets an 80 on both quizzes. And then you have another student who gets 100 on the first quiz and a 60 on the second quiz. Well, they're both going to have an average of an 80, but student A with 2 80s got most of that content, he understood, where student B did really well on the first quiz, she understood it completely, but failed the second one, barely understood half of the material, or just a little over half. So averages can gloss over some of the differences and you lose information by using averages. Using zeros indiscriminately. If you have a 0, what that truly means is that students have 0 knowledge of it. And you want to make sure that if you're using a 0, they truly have 0 knowledge of that content. However, sometimes it may be needed that you use a 0. It could also mean to you that students have not demonstrated that they have knowledge of that. So be careful with zeros, that you know what they mean and that students know what they mean. Providing insufficient instruction before testing, or teaching for one thing but testing for another, is not going to give you accurate results, and it's not fair to assign a grade on inaccurate results. Using pop quizzes to motivate students. Pop quizzes generally, for the majority of students, increase anxiety, so you're not really getting a true picture. It's decreasing your reliability. So pop quizzes are not a good idea. Keeping the nature and content of a test secret. There's no need to do that. Now, that doesn't mean you're giving students the exact answers, but if they know that what's they're expected to know, that's going to lead to deeper learning rather than, I don't know what, cheating. Some teachers think it's cheating, but it's really aiding in learning. Shifting criteria. Having students say that you're going to assess over their content knowledge, and then they write a paper and you really assess their grammar and spelling. So that's shifting criteria. And combining apples and oranges, such as combining effort with content knowledge. So those are 2 separate things. You want to keep them separate. There are different types of scores that you can get along with the different grading methods that you can use. So a type of score, often an assessment, one could be a raw score, so the actual number correct or incorrect out of the total amount. Percentile rank is the measure of how many people that person did the same or better than. So if you said that person scored in the 87th percentile, that person did the same or better than 87% of the individuals who took that test that are in the comparable age range. So if you're thinking of a statewide test, 87th percentile would say that third grader scored the same as or better than 87% of the other third graders in the state. Grade equivalence score, I put it here, but it's not really used. You can read about it in your textbook, but it's a convoluted way and nobody uses it anymore. And then standard scores, which we'll talk about in just a moment with standardized testing.